Indian restaurant he found. But before that, he looked around, he found a shop, a little tailor shop.
More than 30 years after leaving the Rolling Stones, Bill Wyman has finally opened up about the real reasons behind his quiet departure. Long considered the most understated member of the legendary band, Wyman broke his silence in 2024, confirming what many fans had long suspected. He left not because of age or a desire to go solo, but because of persistent disrespect, exclusion, and a growing rift, particularly with guitarist Keith Richards. In October 2024, Wyman appeared at a modest event to relaunch his memoir Stone Alone. When asked about Keith Richards during a short Q&A, he didn't avoid the question. His reply was brief but heavy with truth. "We never truly got along. I have no resentment, but I can't keep pretending. We're from different worlds." With those few words, Wyman publicly acknowledged for the first time that his relationship with Keith had always been strained, and that over time, this emotional and professional distance became impossible to ignore. For decades, Wyman refrained from voicing criticism about his time in the Stones. While fans and insiders whispered about internal power struggles, Wyman never spoke directly. But in this recent interview with Classic Rock, he expanded. "We still exchange Christmas gifts, but I've never really wanted to see Keith again. He's just not the kind of person I can spend time with." It's a stunning revelation from someone who stood beside Richards on stage for 30 years. But Wyman's words weren't driven by bitterness. They reflected a long history of marginalization. In the studio, he was often excluded from decisions, and at times even replaced on bass without warning. Songwriting credits rarely featured his name, and his input into the band's direction was minimal. Despite being an original member and a constant presence, Wyman felt more like a hired hand than a creative equal. Born in 1936 in working-class Lewisham, London, Bill Wyman was nearly a decade older than most of his bandmates. His early life was shaped by poverty, war, and a sense of self-reliance that later separated him from the band's younger, more rebellious spirit. When he joined the Rolling Stones in December 1962, replacing bassist Dick Taylor, Wyman came equipped with his own amplifier and superior technical gear. Even Keith Richards once admitted that Wyman had more actual performance experience than any of them at the time. But this respect didn't last. The band quickly formed into tight circles led by Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, and Charlie Watts. Though Wyman played an essential role musically, he was socially sidelined. Early diaries from 1962 include Wyman's painful observation, "I feel more like a piece of equipment than a member." Despite this, he poured himself into the music. Albums like Aftermath, Between the Buttons, and Out of Our Heads benefited from his steady, precise bass playing. Critics often cited him as the band's rhythmic anchor, quiet but indispensable. Wyman's closest connection within the Stones was Brian Jones, the band's original leader. When Jones became isolated and later died in 1969, the band's internal cohesion shifted dramatically. During Jones' funeral, Wyman chose not to fly with the rest of the group on their private jet. Keith took offense, interpreting it as a lack of unity. From that point, the emotional distance between Wyman and Richards deepened. With Jones gone, Jagger and Richards cemented their leadership. Creative control, songwriting, and decision-making became the exclusive domain of the Jagger-Richards duo. Though Wyman contributed ideas, he even claimed to have helped develop the riff for Jumpin' Jack Flash. He was excluded from songwriting credits. Similarly, it was Wyman who had advocated for releasing I Can't Get No Satisfaction, a decision that proved pivotal, yet he received no public recognition. By the mid-1980s, Wyman found himself in financial difficulty, despite decades of loyalty and performance. While Jagger and Richards earned ongoing royalties from songwriting and publishing, Wyman, who had no writing credits, struggled. In a 2024 interview with Guitar.com, he revealed he had fallen into $200,000 of debt. "I made about 1/10 of what they did," he said, "and that had nothing to do with how much I worked." As time passed, the Rolling Stones evolved from a musical group into a full-fledged business empire. Wyman began to feel alienated from the increasingly corporate structure. Though he was present at every tour, recording session, and promotional event, he had no say in major decisions, whether about albums, tours, or even stage production. In an unaired 1991 interview later released in 2020, a journalist asked Wyman how he felt about being cut out of creative decisions. His answer: "I wasn't excluded. I was never invited." It was this quiet resignation, more than any outburst, that defined Wyman's final years with the group. The 1989 to 1990 Steel Wheels/Urban Jungle Tour marked the band's largest comeback. While fans saw a unified band on stage, Wyman later admitted that he felt like a side player. "I was just handed the schedule," he said. "I wasn't part of the conversation." During the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 1989, Keith didn't mention Wyman at all. The omission passed with little media attention, but fans noticed and questioned. In 1991, Wyman told the band he was leaving. The response he recalled in a 1993 interview was petty, ungracious. Keith Richards never thanked him publicly, and in his 2010 memoir Life, Keith described Wyman as replaceable. Mick Jagger made similarly dismissive remarks, once saying, "If we need someone on bass, I'll do it." Wyman called that the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. Even after he left, he didn't respond with anger, just a quiet, lasting sense of disappointment. After officially exiting the band, Wyman didn't disappear from music. In 1997, he formed Bill Wyman's Rhythm Kings, a band dedicated to blues and rock and roll without commercial pressure. Albums like Struttin' Our Stuff and Any Way the Wind Blows were critically praised for their authenticity, even if they didn't chart. Wyman also continued releasing solo music and had earlier found success with tracks like "Cici, Je suis un rockstar" in 1981. Beyond music, he became a published author, photographer, and amateur archaeologist. His books, including Rolling with the Stones, 2002, featured a massive private archive of band history, a collection he began in the 1960s and maintained personally. Despite the difficult past, Wyman stayed in occasional contact with some former bandmates. He remained close with drummer Charlie Watts until Watts' death in 2021. "We're like distant relatives," he said in 2024. "I don't see them often, but I know they're still there." In 2012, Wyman briefly rejoined the Stones for 2 songs during their 50th anniversary concerts in London. Though it was seen as a moment of reconciliation, it didn't last. There was no real mending, just a symbolic gesture. Then in 2023, he returned to record bass for 1 song on the Hackney Diamonds album, Live by the Sword, marking his first studio contribution since 1989. It was also the final track featuring Charlie Watts. There was no press blitz, no headlines. But for those who had followed the band's long journey, it was a quiet, meaningful close to a chapter long left unfinished. Though rarely in the spotlight, Bill Wyman's musical contributions were enormous. The rolling, propulsive bass lines on Miss You, Paint It Black, Under My Thumb, and others defined the Stones' sound just as much as any guitar riff or vocal hook. As Richards once said, the bass sits between the heart and the spine of a song. For over 30 years, that role was Wyman's, and he played it with consistency and clarity. In addition to his musical foundation, Wyman was the band's most meticulous documentarian. He preserved everything, from photos and set lists to tickets and letters, providing future historians with a rare inside look at the Stones' rise. His work shaped 2 of the most definitive books ever written about the band. Many bassists from later generations like John Deacon, Queen, Adam Clayton, U2, and Alex James, Blur, have cited Wyman as an influence. Not because he was flashy, but because he was solid, precise, and dependable. In many ways, his restraint became his signature. He didn't crave attention, he craved honesty in music. As the 1980s progressed, the disparity between Bill Wyman and the rest of the Rolling Stones, especially Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, grew more difficult to ignore. Despite being a founding member and one of the band's most consistent performers, Bill was increasingly left out of vital discussions and creative processes. He was no longer consulted about key decisions, be it songwriting, set lists, or production choices. At times, he would arrive at studio sessions only to find his parts already recorded by someone else. Keith Richards, in particular, often laid down bass lines himself without informing Bill, an act that chipped away at the trust and camaraderie that once held the band together. The situation worsened during the band's 1989 to 1990 Steel Wheels and Urban Jungle tours. These tours were massive undertakings, meant to revitalize the band's image and reconnect with their global fan base after years of tension between Mick and Keith. To the public, Bill Wyman's presence on stage represented unity and a return to form. But behind the scenes, he was little more than a hired player. He had no say in the stage design, lighting, song order, or even musical arrangements. All of that was decided by a small circle, primarily Mick and Keith, who treated the other band members as supporting cast. For Bill, this was the final confirmation that his place in the band had become symbolic rather than substantive. Despite being one of the original Rolling Stones, his creative input and voice had been all but erased. When the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1989, Keith Richards notably failed to mention Bill during his acceptance speech. While the media barely picked up on it, longtime fans did. Forums and fan groups questioned how someone who had helped define the Stones' sound for decades could be so easily ignored. By 1991, Bill had had enough. In a quiet, private meeting with the band, he announced that he would not be continuing. There was no dramatic confrontation, no emotional send-off. The reaction from Mick and Keith, according to Bill, was cold and dismissive. They neither thanked him for his years of service nor tried to convince him to stay. Bill later described their reaction as petty and ungracious. He expected at least a gesture of appreciation after 3 decades of commitment. Instead, he received silence and distance. In a 1993 interview, when asked about Bill's departure, Mick Jagger infamously downplayed his absence, saying, "If we need someone on bass, I'll do it." To Bill, this statement summed up everything that had gone wrong. The lack of respect, the disregard for his skill, and the assumption that anyone could do what he did. In truth, Bill Wyman's playing was irreplaceable in its subtlety and control. He wasn't flashy, but his bass lines anchored the Stones' sound for decades. Songs like Under My Thumb, 19th Nervous Breakdown, and Miss You owe much of their groove and staying power to Bill's steady hand. After officially stepping down, Bill avoided the temptation to air his grievances in public. He didn't launch attacks or demand back pay, though he would later reveal he earned just a fraction of what Mick and Keith did. The royalties, the publishing rights, the branding, these financial benefits were concentrated among the core songwriting duo, while Bill and other members were largely left out. In interviews from the late 1990s and early 2000s, Bill said plainly that he had contributed just as much to the band's success in performance and presence, but that didn't translate into influence or earnings. By the mid-1980s, he was in serious financial difficulty, despite being part of one of the most commercially successful bands in the world. Following his exit, the band chose not to replace him with a full-time member. Instead, session musician Daryl Jones took over the bass role. Talented and consistent, Jones played with the Stones for years, but he was never granted official membership. Many fans saw this as symbolic. The band had moved from being a group of collaborators to a brand controlled by its 2 figureheads. Bill, on the other hand, found a new freedom. No longer bound by band politics or commercial expectations, he returned to the kind of music he truly loved: rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and jazz. In 1997, he formed Bill Wyman's Rhythm Kings, a rotating ensemble of seasoned musicians focused on pure musical enjoyment rather than commercial success. They toured small venues, played festivals, and recorded several albums that received strong reviews. While they never topped charts, critics and fans alike praised their honesty and soul. For Bill, this project was more than just a band. It was a return to music for its own sake. He also found time to revisit his other passions. Bill had always been an archivist at heart. Throughout his career with the Stones, he meticulously kept journals, took thousands of photographs, and saved letters, tickets, and set list. These materials became the foundation for his books, particularly Stone Alone, 1990, and Rolling with the Stones, 2002. These works, full of personal photos and candid observations, are considered among the most detailed and valuable histories of the band ever published. In Stone Alone, Bill already hinted at the divide between himself and Keith. He depicted the early days of the Stones as a group effort, with Brian Jones at the helm, not the Jagger-Richards-centric tale told in later years. This directly contradicted the narrative Keith promoted in his own 2010 memoir, Life, where he positioned himself and Mick as the creative nucleus of the band. Bill's version of history didn't seek to rewrite it for drama. Rather, it painted a picture of a band that once worked as a collective before evolving into a hierarchy. The bond between Bill and Brian Jones had been particularly strong. Both felt somewhat alienated, Bill because of his age and background, and Brian because of his increasing estrangement from the others. After Brian's death in 1969, Bill found himself further isolated. His refusal to fly with the band to the funeral only deepened the rift with Keith, who interpreted the act as disloyalty. From then on, Keith began assuming more and more control, and Bill's voice grew fainter within the band's internal structure. Yet despite decades of underappreciation, Bill never lashed out. Even when Keith in Life wrote that Bill was totally replaceable, Bill didn't respond publicly. Instead, he continued making music, creating art, and quietly asserting his identity outside the shadow of the Rolling Stones. He developed a reputation not just as a musician, but as a historian, photographer, and writer. In 2012, Bill briefly reunited with the band during their 50th anniversary concerts in London. He played 2 songs, just enough to mark the occasion, not enough to suggest a full return. Keith Richards made no comment about Bill's presence. Mick Jagger said simply, "It was nice having Bill back." That moment was interpreted by many as an attempt at reconciliation, but for Bill, it was likely closure. In 2023, Bill recorded bass for a single track on the Stones' Hackney Diamonds album. The song, Live by the Sword, also featured Charlie Watts on drums, making it the final recording to include both Bill and Charlie, the band's original rhythm section. It was a subtle, quiet moment that closed the book on their shared musical legacy. No grand announcement was made, no interviews followed, but for fans, it was deeply meaningful. By 2024, over 30 years after his departure, Bill finally spoke more openly about why he left. At a reissue launch for Stone Alone, he was asked about Keith Richards. His reply, "We never truly got along. I have no resentment, but I can't keep pretending. We're from different worlds." For the first time, Bill confirmed what many had long suspected. His departure was not about age or solo ambitions. It was about being quietly marginalized, excluded from decisions, and treated as an outsider in a band he had helped build. In an interview with Classic Rock, he elaborated, "We still exchange Christmas gifts, but I've never really wanted to see Keith again. He's just not the kind of person I can spend long stretches of time with." The sentiment wasn't spiteful, it was simply honest. Bill had outgrown the band, or perhaps the band had outgrown what it originally stood for. Looking back, Bill Wyman's role in the Rolling Stones can't be measured by flashy solos or media presence. He was the foundation, the heart between the drums and the guitars. His consistency allowed the chaos at the front of the stage to thrive without toppling. His journals preserve the band's story more faithfully than any documentary. His departure marked the end of the Rolling Stones as a democratic band and the beginning of their life as a business enterprise. Bill's story is not just about being overlooked. It's about choosing dignity over ego, art over commerce, and self-worth over legacy. He didn't walk away bitter. He walked away fulfilled. He didn't demand acknowledgement. He let the music speak for itself. And even after decades of silence, when he finally spoke, it wasn't to settle scores. It was to say one thing clearly: I gave enough. He never needed the spotlight to shine. He just needed to be heard, and now, finally, he has been. If this story made you feel something, nostalgia, anger, respect, tell us in the comments. Hit like if you believe legacies shouldn't be written by just the loudest voices. And if you want more untold stories behind music's biggest legends, we've got some powerful ones coming your way.